Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Now, are we going to be able to feed the world and take care of global warming, both? And is there enough food already? And what are we going to do 50 years from now? Okay, if you haven't been missing any sleep, this, I think, is the sort of thing that could normally keep you awake at night. But I've got a person here who's going to help. My friend Harriet Friedmann, who's a very dear longtime friend. When I first met her, she was studying the wheat industry. I think a PhD thesis from Harvard. Is that right, Harriet?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then she became a colleague of mine. So for many years we were in the same department. Now she's in Vancouver, and she's going to Lund afterward, and is constantly on the road solving the world's food problems.
Right.
Well, that's a good introduction. Now, tell us what to do, Harriet. Anyway, she's in Vancouver, and she's already given me a brief on the very interesting work that she's doing lately. And so let's start at the top, Harriet. How are we going to save the world and also have a livable climate?
Through valuing the diversity of life, including the life in the parts of the earth that we choose to produce our food. Mm-hmm. In 1992 at the Rio meetings, there were two parallel agreements and complementary agreements. One was the Convention on Climate Change, and the other was the Convention on Biological Diversity.
By the way, were those seen then as complementary or part of the same problem, or were they seen as totally different issues?
No, I think they were complementary, though the way that things, this is a kind of history of science question, the way that research and certainly policy unfolds is crucially determined by the categories you create at the beginning.
At least you understand it as part of the same problem.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So if we understand the balance of gases in the atmosphere, as earth scientists do, then we understand that the balance is kept by the ratio of plants and animals and by the number of them, so that our climate, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the carbon, are passing through the bodies of living things. And we've known that for a long time. Plants produce carbon dioxide, humans produce oxygen. Sorry, the other way around. Plants produce oxygen, humans and other animals produce carbon dioxide as waste. And so there's an exchange of gases, but all the energy is coming from the sun. So the plants are the original sources of energy for life, and they are the place where we need to intervene in order to feed ourselves.
And they produce oxygen.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is what keeps the balance with the carbon dioxide too. They sequester carbon by growing, right? So as their roots go down, or as they multiply on the surface of the earth, they sequester carbon. Now, what's happened, I think, is that carbon politics have become very institutionalized and bureaucratic, even starting with the language of separating between mitigation and adaptation. That's a second step after you separate between climate and life, right? Because climate and life are interacting. They're co-producing each other. So we got into this climate thing. We got into the mitigation and adaptation thing. We got into targets that are deeply negotiated and lots of politics over, even though everyone knows that they're not adequate, even if everyone pursued them. The international politics of that were quite specific about how do you measure what do you use, population or a baseline to measure the starting point for which carbon reductions would be agreed by each government, because the less industrial, more populous countries wanted a different way of measuring it from the industrial countries that could start from a higher baseline because they already had a lot of carbon being produced, so they could start theoretically, right, reducing it. Now, the Biodiversity Convention had more to do with the control. They were worried about biopiracy. Most of the biodiversity in the world is in what we call the global south. That most of the food plants in the world started there. If you count the Middle East as the origin of wheat, maize from Mexico and Central America, potatoes from Peru, our basic starchy staples. The concern was about biodiversity and biopiracy, and there was this idea of commons as a global commons, meaning free access to anyone, which means those with the most power and resources had more access than anyone else. And then by the time, not very long after, only 3 or 4 years after, when the World Trade Organization and the TRIPS agreement came into force, patents on life forms and on plants and seeds were put in place, plus mechanisms to enforce that. So that was in contradiction to the Convention on Biodiversity, which allowed governments to monitor the plants that were crossing their borders both ways.
Okay, this piracy thing, if I'm not mistaken, that's about appropriating seeds that had been developed by farmers anywhere in the world and kind of patenting them and making them proprietary so people cannot freely use their own seeds. Is that?
That's the big picture. And it wasn't theft when the rule said anyone can take anything anywhere. It was within the law. It's just bad law. And so from some points of view. So from the points of view of the countries, which have since negotiated, we're getting into a whole different area from what we talked about before, but they've since negotiated access and benefit sharing, which means that they've given up trying to monitor or at least control the plants that go across their border both ways. They have to worry about invasive species too. So coming in as well as going out, that's been very hard to actually unfold under the Convention on Biodiversity. So they now they've negotiated this access and benefit sharing regime, which means that it's being worked out in practice, that the bureaucracy set up to try to give them some share in what the corporations.
Is this going to solve the thing, or is that just a?
No, I don't. It's all. So all of these things become very bureaucratized. So where I'm coming from is, and people's whole careers get built on very increasingly complex models of both what the climate is or what the loss of biodiversity is in that language. I prefer species death or ecosystem destruction. So they get all wrapped up in these very technical details that their whole careers are built on. And so it's hard to see from a sociological point of view how you exit that, but things are happening outside it. So even for climate, we know cities, for instance, some governments are doing way more than they've agreed to. So it doesn't all happen at government level. The shift to sustainable energy has now reached an economic tipping point. It has for the last couple of years. That doesn't mean the fossil fuel industry isn't going to try to dig every last bit of drop of everything out of the ocean floor, the melting ice caps, everything else.
Or the oil sands in Alberta.
Absolutely. So, and this, and it seems that many countries, many minds are caught in the trap that makes it hard to get out of it, even when actually banks are starting to say, well, maybe fossils aren't the future. Now, for biodiversity, it had to do with the conflict between the rights of governments under the convention, and especially the Biosafety Protocol, which would be parallel to the Kyoto Protocol, that it tried to institute that was in conflict with the World Trade Organization intellectual property regime. Okay. So I think that's probably a big piece of why the Convention on Biodiversity has been pushed to the side, but it's coming back in now. like Joni Mitchell says, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And even then, we're knowing more and more that when we or our children experience degraded ecosystems, they can't possibly know what was there before, what it was like before. But we're making the world less and less lively all the time. And we're doing it, as a lot of the Save the World people with whom I disagree in food, they say we need to stop expanding agriculture because we're destroying the forest with agriculture. And they're the ones who say we need to do that in order to feed the world. And that's why you have a conflict that you posed between climate and life. There's no conflict. It's like saying there's a conflict between breathing and drinking, Well,
That's beautiful. I love that. Okay, let me go back a little bit. You mentioned invasive species. Is that an important part of the whole discussion of biodiversity, or is there, if you will, a little conflict between those two concerns?
If you divide these issues up and try to deal with them separately, you get into the mess we're in. And that if you start from a different place, and my current heroes are James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, the Gaia perspective that has completely transformed earth sciences and is yet to enter fully or even very well into popular consciousness, that the earth is in some kind of homeostasis. We don't have to say it's an organism. We don't have to go that far. But to say that the atmosphere on which we depend has a history, it didn't always exist. It's not stable. It only exists because it passes through organisms in a certain way. They've evolved, but we are devolving it. We are simplifying the earth. So it started with colonialism. So what the basic pattern is they go into, let's say, a Caribbean island, say Cuba or Haiti, and the indigenous people there are either killed or incorporated somehow, like Marianne or whatever. People are rediscovering their indigenous ancestries now in various places politically. So they clear the landscape of its trees, its plants, its humans and other animals, and they introduce a monoculture of a plant they've brought from Asia. Sugar. I mean, it's gone via the Canary Islands and it's had a little journey over a long period of time. And the planters come from England or France. They're the second sons not inheriting, whatever the reason is, they become planters. So the Europeans come, take the land, start the slave trade, and they deepen the slavery through bringing slaves on a mass scale to the New World. And so they create this simplified ecosystem that can't even feed itself. So a new industry develops, which is cod in New England and the Maritimes of Canada, which is dried and sent down to be the food for slaves on the plantation.
What kind of food is dried?
Dried cod.
Is that right? Oh.
Yeah. So it's still the national dish of Jamaica is saltfish, rice, which is from Asia or Africa. They're two varieties. And ackee, which is from Africa. So what you get are reconstituted agronomies and cuisines in the margins of the monoculture. They're done by the creativity of the people who encounter each other from different parts of the world, and the plants that they've brought with them, and the knowledge, this is really crucial, the knowledge of how to grow them, how to cook them, how to prepare them. So our categories of invasive species, I really am answering your question, the categories of invasive species, that category is being questioned now, because all of our world since 1500 involves the transplantation of people and of plants and of animals so that the landscapes and what I'm calling the biocultural landscapes, not my phrase, but the biocultural landscapes have been reconstructed. And that's true even of very ancient places like India or China. One of my favorite questions to my students who were largely South Asian in the Mississauga campus at the University of Toronto would be, well, how long do you think chilies or potatoes, make one up, have been part of Indian cuisine? And what's the answer? They'll say, always, because that's what we fill in. We fill in and always. People will say this in supermarkets about new products.
I would have guessed potatoes more recently because I know they came from South America.
Yeah, so did chilies.
I guess I would have assumed that they were indigenous, no?
No, absolutely not.
Where'd they come from?
They came from Central America, and they were introduced to Asia, well, at least to India first, by the Portuguese through Goa. And they took off like crazy. People love them. And they put them in their gardens. Also tomatoes from Central America. It's a very rich, there are centers of biodiversity, and Central America is one of them. And North America is not. Okay, so if we want to go to the next phase, so what's an invasive species? It depends. It depends. It's like a weed. A weed is a plant you don't like. So,
okay.
Yeah, so it's tricky. It's not that there isn't such a thing.
Well, I guess one has to simply not ask whether it's invasive or not, whether it's indigenous or not, but whether it's harmful or not, whether it fits together with, like the stories about the rabbits being brought into Australia and no predators. I guess somebody better think twice before introducing something that might get out of the box.
Yeah, we're full of those things. And often the best intention to try to use biological controls for a pest turn out fine or wrong, because the thing that's brought in, winds up taking over and simplifying the ecosystem. So that would be my criterion. Does it make the ecosystem more complex or more simple? And that's not going to lead in a suspected direction usually, because just like sugar was an introduced crop that simplified the Caribbean, so wheat, cattle, just about corn, maize from South America, just about certainly soy from Asia, all of those things that cover the fields of North America, of the southern cone in Latin America, of Australia, and all those settler states from the 19th century, those plants are all introduced and they simplify the landscape. And so I wouldn't necessarily call that an invasive species, unless we call the humans who came with it one too, which you certainly could. And we're being forced and certainly invited to talk about the settler colonialism that has produced the simplified cultural and biophysical landscapes that we see. So what we have now is a world that is dependent on introduced crops, that is wheat, cattle, to the places where they were not native, where they displaced indigenous people, bison, perennial grasses on most grasslands. We've simplified those, and the world has become dependent on the food that grows very well there, if we mean by food only those crops, because they marginalize everything else. They marginalize forests, they marginalize what are now being called orphan crops, millet in Africa or India, cassava.
That's a new
orphan means they've been abandoned by international capital, basically. And so people have been, by taking over land, to say we are going to feed the world by growing more efficiently on large areas of land. This is happening massively in Africa now. Other places as well. If we, that is somebody, takes over the land that's being used in a complex way.
You say that they're more complex and that what's happening now is a trend toward simplification.
Absolutely. absolutely. And the simplification involves transplantation, and it involves simplification not only of the landscape, but also of the knowledge to grow. So even when wheat settlers came in the 19th century, industrial workers were able to learn how to grow wheat pretty easily, because that's a lot of who came, not only. What they had to do was grow it in a very different place where there was stored fertility that they could mine. It's been extractive. Agriculture has been extractive like mining. It was called soil mining by some visionaries in the early 20th century. But we just said, oh, that's okay. We can put industrial nitrogen in instead. Don't worry about losing fertility. Industrial nitrogen winds up running into the rivers and creating dead zones. And not to worry, we will engineer the crops so that they're more efficient and we'll have less nitrogen runoff. So what I'm saying is that is part of a deepening of simplification.
Mm-hmm.
Palm oil is the last phase, and you know what palm oil is used for.
Give us a little pitch on palm oil. I take it you don't like it.
Well, palm oil, it's not that I dislike it. It's like, it's out of place and out of scale. So palm oil is indigenous to West Africa. Lots of people will have a tree that it's part of their cuisine. Every cuisine needs a fat of some kind in it. And that's perfectly fine agronomically and as far as I know. I'm not a nutritionist, for diet, and people have lived on it for a long time. When you transplant it and create massive monocultural plantations, not part of mixed farms, as they did by bringing it to Asia, cutting down those forests. Now they're doing it in Latin America. It's because there's a demand for it. But chances are very low that you actually buy palm oil in the supermarket.
Uh-huh.
But it is growing, and the customers are industries. They're processed food industries, because palm oil has certain qualities that make it more conducive to industrial denaturing of ingredients and reconstructing of them into what appear to be more and more diverse commodities, but they're actually more and more simple commodities where they change the texture and the taste and the flavors in every kind of way in the lab on the basis of fewer and fewer plants. So palm oil is become really important in the processed food industry, which of course we're finally realizing is causing our chronic health problems. Mm-hmm. And it's in cosmetics. So we are cutting down forests to grow palm, and then when there's too much of it, they use some of it for biodiesel, which is supposedly sustainable relative to fossils, right? We're going to have bio crops, right? Bioenergy. So, and that's what they do with the surplus corn as well. And so we're locked into this system where all of our regulatory structures, inherited ones, push this monoculture that started on the basis of transplanted and simplified plants, humans, knowledge. And we have to work our way out of it. And to me, the signpost of whether we're going in the right direction, because it's far away right now, is whether we're making it more diverse.
I see. Now, wait a minute. Let me really throw a spanner in. What about GMO? You haven't mentioned that yet, and I don't know what to think about that.
Okay. The problem with the debate for or against is that it's for or against not the technology, but the agenda that's driving the research. So if the research is driven by the goal of creating more of a monopoly for a particular seed owned by a particular company, which was Monsanto's agenda with glyphosate and the first genetically engineered crops, then it's a real problem. And if it's only trying to fix the problems it itself has created, then they might make some improvement that way, but it doesn't solve the problem. The problem is still we're moving in the wrong direction. If, on the other hand, genetic techniques and the knowledge of how to work with genes, work at the molecular level, if that is used instead to rescue plants, particularly that have been marginalized by this whole system and that are under stress, because all our ecosystems are deteriorating, stress from pests, stress from fungus, whatever it is, a disease, then fine. That it's not the technology that's a threat. The technology could actually be a support for a revitalization of landscapes that are healthy for all living things, including humans. Mm-hmm. It could be, and we may need it for that because there's been so much degradation. But the agenda that's been driving most of it has been to simplify and to expel the people who use the land in a diverse way, including those farmers or the descendants of those farmers who first domesticated these plants that we all depend on, and the places where they still continue to help them evolve in their original habitat. Those seeds have been used multiple times to rescue failures, because if you have a monocultural field of one variety, then it's like a banquet for insects or any other kind of pest, right? So it's diverse farming that helps in a variety of ways to manage the problems rather than to try to kill everything and wind up with killing ourselves, basically.
Tell me what we are supposed to do to make a difference about biodiversity, because if this convention has been ignored and it's time for us to do something about it, what is it we should do?
Well, it may be that, like the climate convention, that's not where the main positive changes are coming. Things have to be done at the appropriate scale, which has to be discovered. So we need to diversify at the farm level. We need to diversify at the landscape level. We need to diversify at the global level. I'll give you an example from Southern Ontario. So one of our being the people trying to change the food system, one of our favorite people in Southern Ontario, certainly our favorite farmer, no, not certainly, one of our favorite farmers is Brian Gilvesi of YU Ranch. And his journey is a microcosm of what could be the path for industrial farmers to get to a sustainable place. He was a tobacco farmer in Norfolk County. They were very prosperous in the 1950s, the tobacco farmers there. That tanked for a variety of reasons. Less that people were smoking less, but more that it was being grown other places. And it's a whole other story, right? How these specialized regions are brought into competition with each other so that they can't actually prosper by specializing in those. But anyway, so from his point of view, tobacco tanked. He started, a lot of his neighbors got into vegetables. It took a while. The soil was very polluted from tobacco, monoculture.
Tobacco does something harmful to the soil itself.
Oh, yeah. But partly it's monoculture, and they had to use a lot of chemicals, and partly it's tobacco, which depletes a lot. So what they had to do is recover the soil, and this is good news that you can. Mm-hmm. So some of them got into vegetables. Brian got into longhorn cattle, which from Texas, they can live outside. He became very knowledgeable. He became I don't know if he's president, something of the Longhorn Cattle Association of North America or whatever. And they live outside. So instead of the division, he's reversing, he's reconnecting. So instead of the division between plants and animals in different operations, bring them back together, have the animals on grass. So they live outside and they're healthy. You give them hay in the winter. They reproduce in the field. All of the objections that we have to the way that industrial meat is produced are answered there. Of course, it's more expensive. That's how the industrial meat did. But anyway, so he has managed to sell to high-end restaurants, to individuals. You can get some. But what more important is that, and he advocates for payment to farmers for environmental services. And that's an interesting discussion about whether that is a good path or a bad path. But it is a path, certainly.
Yeah, the discussion being whether to eat meat at all.
No, it's the discussion in this case is whether to support a transition for farmers by paying them for sequestering carbon.
I see. So we've skipped over the controversial thing about meat. But
we can get to that if you want. Okay.
In your story, I should let you tell your story.
Yeah. So, okay. So he started producing high-end cattle, which are more, in my view, wholesome, in the way that they're able to live their cattle lives, right? And are happy until the end, and that's my criterion for meat at the moment. We can talk about the history of domestication and of mixed farming and what role animals play in it. He wanted to get back to the perennial grasses that were native, and now they become so rare that they're actually expensive. So what he needed was help to get the financial help to get the native seeds, plant them as wildlife habitat. He was supported by Ducks Unlimited, a wildlife hunters. Hunters are big on conservation since the formation of the World Wildlife Fund in the 19th century. Save the lions so we can shoot them. So this is save the birds, the migrating birds, so we can shoot them, which is fine because we eat too. I don't have a problem with that. In any case, these stories about a reconfiguration are always unexpected from our conventional categories, and so they're really good to know. So he got help from them. That is a payment for an environmental service to maintain and increase wildlife habitat for these migrating birds on his farm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So once it's there, though, it's really happy. So this is not like an ongoing subsidy like the U.S. does for corn. You got to pay it every year. This is a one-time investment.
Because then these grasses they don't need any help.
Absolutely. And once you have more and more of them, they don't become expensive for other farmers anymore either, right? So that's a big piece of the picture of and it's very parallel. So I think we're moving into a new world order if we make it. We may not make it, but the one that's trying to emerge is distributed instead of centralized. So that's why solar panels and a feed-in tariff are a really radically different and sustainable way of producing energy. So I had to pay for the solar panels on my roof, but then I get free energy from that on. And it's even better with the seeds because they take care of themselves more or less. I might have to replace a few of the tubes or something, that goes wrong on my panels. So it is a similar idea. So he did that. And then he had to become by phases an agroecologist.
Even farmers call themselves agroecologists.
The ones who do it this way. Yeah. Now, if you're accepting a seed package from Monsanto that includes the seeds, the chemicals, the instructions about when to plant, the insurance, if things go wrong and you've done what they said, then that's one way, right? That's one kind of farmer. And we're trying to switch that kind of farmer to another kind of farmer, which is one that develops the knowledge himself. And that knowledge is also about the diversity of the interactions between what we often call wild and domestic. So we've got these native grasses that were introduced originally for the wild migrating birds, but then become a way of managing that.
Wait a minute, he introduced them for managing wild birds, and he got the Ducks Unlimited to help do that.
That's right. And he wants the government to help with not just migrating birds, but everything.
But these perennial grasses had been there long ago.
Long ago.
so they just vanished because they've been replaced by
monocultural fields.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. In his case, tobacco. And there was probably something there before. It might have been, who knows? But would have been a long time ago.
Okay.
Because that got squeezed out when the wheat moved to the West and so on. So, but the monoculture is more important than which crop. The growing of a single crop one at a time. And then we can talk about it ecologically, we can talk about it economically. Economically, farmers are trapped into relationships around that crop. And if the crop tanks, they either go out of business or have to scramble around and find a way to do something different. And if the different thing is another monocultural crop, they never get out of that cycle. That's been the history for, depending on which part of the world you're looking at, for 500 years.
But may I pause you on this about the reason for perennial grasses is that they're better at sequestering carbon. So we want
that we would say that. Some people would say that now, but that wasn't the original motivation for looking at them. The original motivation for looking at them was what I started with, which is that it's unsustainable from the point of view of maintaining, not to say regenerating, the soil and the water. The kind of production of the crops that enter into global commerce, the ones we call food when we use a word like food crisis, because the price of wheat has gone up, the price of maize has gone up, the price of soy, not the price of broccoli. That's not what they're talking about when we look at, because they're not even measured as global prices, right?
I didn't know that.
It's a handful of crops
and
a handful of animals. So really wheat, which has become minor now. The two big ones are soy and maize. Now, soy's been grown forever in Asia, but the main sources of soy in the world market, the ones that get prices out there in the world market, investments and so on, are grown in transplanted places in North America.
As a monoculture.
South America, and it's the simplest possible rotation with maize because it does put nitrogen in the soil. But I mean, we can get there. But the point is that maize and soy are the biggest, and you know what it depends how you measure it, but at least half, probably more than half of those crops produced commercially, right, to sell on international markets, are not used for food. They're used to feed animals, not for human food. They're used to feed animals, or now to feed airplanes and cars and so on. And what they do is they just displace all the other crops. That's why vegetables become so expensive. It used to be really easy to get an apple, even during the Depression. There were bread lines, not apple lines, because those were grown in yards everywhere. They were grown commercially on the fringes of the city. So our cities have grown and paved over a lot of that. And the agricultural side, a lot of that hasn't been nearly as profitable as growing maize and soy, which are to different degrees subsidized, and they are to feed animals. So even in Ontario, under supply management, we have had our landscape completely simplified. So it's maize and soybeans, and that's under the regime of supply management, which is an attempt to, regulate or buffer the dairy farmers from world markets, but it still had this perverse effect because the effect has to do with monoculture, and there are different regulatory paths to produce monoculture. And so what we're describing with Brian Gilvesi is a potential regulatory path which would be very different to increase diversity by bringing environmental or ecological concerns right into the center. So let me finish the story with Brian, because we haven't finished there. And that is, he put in these plants, he started trying to understand the relationship between the animals, the plants, and the pasture, and when to allow his cattle to go into the perennial grass fields to graze, which also manages those grass fields, because those grass fields were always managed by indigenous people in some way too.
Really?
There's nothing we can. That's another step to get into.
I didn't know that.
Not in a way that looks like our fields, but they certainly were. And so, so how to deal with that relationship? How to understand? You have to understand a lot. the internet makes a lot possible too, plus these associations of growers who are going in this direction, or even the individual ones. He can learn about longhorn cattle from the Longhorn Cattle Association, but not necessarily how to manage the relationship between them and these perennial grasses he's planted. So he's working on that. He needs to clean up this. He wants to clean up the stream. It's a beautiful ecosystem there. It's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site in that part of Lake Erie, where the river that goes by his farm is. So he uses solar panels. It's not about going back to anything. He uses solar panels to pump the water up for the cattle so they won't go into the stream and pollute it with their poop, right? And he can't clean up the stream by himself because it's running through the whole area. So he has to get his neighbors involved. And they are neighbors, and they've been there for a long time. And as he prospers, and as he get his neighbors to cooperate, he can bring people from the city on tours of how the landscape is becoming more diverse. They have to do a little shifting because most of the land has been flattened for the old monoculture.
Oh.
So sometimes you have to reconstruct it. You certainly want to bring forested areas back. For the landscape, for the river part, you want the riparian border, that is trees and animals along the border. And there are different ways to integrate forestry with farming, which has always been the tradition in agrarian systems until industrial monoculture started. Everything gets simplified in a monoculture, mm-hmm. and the knowledge gets reduced drastically. So what Brian did is he started increasing his knowledge of all these relationships, of how to bring back bluebirds, because then things start to be more lively. These perennial grasses include sunflowers, which are one of the few things that are native to North America that we eat on a large scale. They're beautiful, right? They are. And then you have the birds, and you have the local birds and the migrating birds, and you have the cattle, which are your source of income in this case. There's certainly more ways to do this and to grow many things. And then you want, because the bees are dying, you want pollinating insects. So we start figuring out how to bring back native bees who are a lot less photogenic than our honeybees, which are imported, right? They are from the old world. Okay. Yeah, they're one of the honeybees are one of the first domestic animals.
Well, they still have to import them, as I understand it. When the local population of bees get in trouble, they go hunting around the world for some batch that hasn't, some hives that, they can bring in to rejuvenate things.
That's right. That's a microcosm of the problem.
Uh-huh.
That's the same way they go to Central America to find maize seeds that the farmers are still cultivating to adapt, because climates always change some, to adapt. And sometimes it changes very drastically in a short time, long ago. So they bring those seeds in to fix in the lab the problems they've created by having just one variety or two or three, not many, in the fields. That's why they all look so standard. They're all the same height in these straight rows, right? And it's not just because they're genetically engineered. That has been an extension or a deepening of the simplification that went on before that.
But now these native bees that he found, they're just as good for his purposes?
For pollinating, especially for pollinating native grasses. They co-pollinate.
How about making honey? Do they make honey?
No, not for making honey, no. They don't make honey. They're not photogenic. Their services are what we would call environmental. So like if we kill all of them, but they've been marginalized. When we marginalize the world they live in, when we take away the wild grasses that were their food, then they become marginal too. They still exist. And so it becomes, we now have to bring back as many of the species as possible that are still being destroyed, marginalized with these simplified systems.
Now your explanation troubles me, because the only reason this guy got started with his reform movement is because the business wasn't going so well. So we have to say that from inferring from what you say, that only if monoculture gets in deep trouble and isn't as productive financially, can we expect people to take up anything better. Let's find a more a hopeful incentive system. Is there anything that can be?
Well, that's what he's arguing for. He's arguing that government should change their policy. If governments in Canada, or in the US especially, but the EU, were to change the way that they regulate and even pay for certain agricultural practices, if they could just get rid of the subsidies we have now, which are way past their best before date, and transfer them instead to payments which could be very much less and could be time limited, with the time horizon, very much less, to invest in the reconstitution of the relationships that the plants and the animals and the soil microorganisms want to have with each other.
Wow, that's beautiful. It's like an addition to something else that we have to think about is to stop subsidizing fossil fuel industry.
Absolutely.
And if we did that, we'd be halfway there. And now you've just added a beautiful component. Stop subsidizing monoculture.
And if you stop subsidizing fossil fuel, then the relative costs of this fossil fuel dependent monoculture would also change.
Oh boy.
That's
okay. Sounds like we've got 2 additional planks we ought to put on our platform for survival, because those 2 things are exactly key, aren't they? Beautiful. Yeah. Proceed. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I was just overcome by joy.
There were lots of threads that got dropped here and there, So I'll leave it to you to pick one up if you want.
Well, one of the things is, way back at the beginning, there was an allusion to an argument that says that we have a competition between planting lots of trees and planting food, and that some people, whom I have not met, but you say they exist, some people are arguing we must not do anything to expand agriculture because we want to use that land for forests. Well, I think I'm certainly into increasing the number of forests, but let's see whether or not we can pursue the question of whether or not we can use the requisite amount of land for agriculture and have the plants that are grown there nevertheless contribute to the production of oxygen and the sequestering of carbon.
Yeah, so the problem, in my view, is doing one thing at a time instead of seeing the interrelationships among things. So first of all, that question, right, it's wrongly framed. It's quite intentional. People have an agenda who want to increase monocultural agriculture and make it more efficient, right? More efficient in various ways. Sustainable intensification, it's usually called. And they're the ones who talk about land sparing, not to increase the amount of agricultural land, because they are the noun in who will feed the world. They will feed the world with their industrial systems and the financial systems that are completely implicated in them and so on. And the world, who is the world? Farmers right now are feeding themselves, not the industrial farmers, but the mixed farmers who are left in the world, who become pretty marginalized and their ecosystems pretty degraded, pastoralists, fishers, and so on. They're still feeding themselves, and they're arguments about how to measure it, but a half the world. So what are we talking about with that argument? We're talking about displacing those people to increase the monocultures, and then those people become part of the world that has to be fed with the one crop, that they're going to produce there. And so that's one piece. But the other piece that comes from the positive side is that forests, not the monocultural forests, one thing lined up after, you can see where something's been reforested, right? It's not a real forest, it's a monoculture. they were grown for a long time for timber, and still are, the tree planting, replanting. But
it doesn't have to be done that way, you know, of course.
It doesn't. But why would we destroy forests and then try to create new ones?
Mm-hmm.
And most of the ways we're destroying forests now is for agriculture, whether it's the Amazon for cattle production and soy,
Mm-hmm.
or whether it's Indonesia for palm oil production.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if the train's going to the cliff and you don't know where to go and make the train do anything else, the first thing you do is stop it. You know, stop cutting down the forest. So all this talk about replanting and, you know, all of this would take on a very different, well, of course, we'll probably need to, and learn how to do it well. But the first thing is to stop destroying the ones that exist. And then the second piece is that they have always been mixed with forestry, with agriculture. So agroforestry.
What has been? What's been mixed with
food production in fields and in forested areas have been managed in an intertwined way. So if you look at the rice terraces of Asia, which have lasted for thousands of years, and we can only preserve them now with tourism. It's crazy. Yeah, it's really crazy. Mm-hmm. But if you look at how they work, they have forests at the top of the mountain, and that's where the water is going to flow down over the course of the year. It's incredibly precise knowledge to be able to observe and manage the flow of the water, to maintain those terraces and to maintain the houses of the people who live there along the sides of the terraces, and to coordinate, for instance, when the fish are in the private ponds, which also have vegetables growing over to shade them and so on, and when they are to go into the terraces where they fertilize the rice plants, which are also have little patches of vegetables, even maybe a cow standing on one little spot, you know, something. They have a lot, and ducks and frogs. They've got a lot of things going on in them, but they're mainly about rice, or they're centered on rice, let's say. And the fish both fertilize the rice, and it turns out, they filmed this, the Chinese natural resources people, they jump up and eat the insects.
Fish jump up.
Yeah, they knock over, because it's hard to get big, you know, they knock over the rice plant and eat the insects. So why would we not go with these co-evolved ways of supporting each other that the fish and the humans have, and the ducks and the rice plants and the, you know, all of that. So every sustained, that is, every enduring agricultural system has some mixture like that. And then we can get to animals if you like, and eating them or not. But they've all had these complex managed interrelationships that include forests. Indigenous people were managing landscapes, both grasslands and forested landscapes and valleys, in ways that were not visible. They were not codable to European eyes. And so when they destroyed them, sometimes, William Cronin's written about this beautifully in the early days, when they destroy them by fencing, by evicting, by doing whatever they do, they're just mystified and think it's God's will, you know, that the deer don't come to the same place the way they used to, or that the trees that grow edible food aren't there in the same way, right? So, and there were, because we know some facts that we don't put together with other things very well. So for instance, we know that the death of, I forget, but it was a massive die-off of, if that's the right word, massive genocide of indigenous peoples with the early colonization of North America. And it was for a variety of reasons. It was diseases. It was the cows and horses that ate because there were no grazing animals south of the Andes, right? Until you got to the bison. And so they just totally altered ecosystems. The survivors redomesticated them. So it's very hard to recover what was there before. We know there were lots more people there before. And we know about a few of the massive empires, Aztec, Maya, and so on. But it turns out, this really knocked my socks off, it turns out that the Amazon had cities in it, you know, and not just the Mayan ones that they know about, many more that were just grown over. And those cities were, I use this in a PowerPoint lecture, I put a picture, a reconstructed diagram by archaeologists of a city in the Amazon and one of Paris before industrialization. There's a main pathway through the middle. They're on water. Then they're surrounded by fields and things that you're interested in, for instance, terra preta or biochar, they were using that. And they had fish ponds. They were doing a lot of what we did in a mixed way to, of course, feed a concentrated population.
Mm-hmm.
So when we ask who is going to feed the world, well, cities, Carolyn Steele, Hungry City, if you can get her to get interviewed, that would be
okay. Carolyn Steele, what?
Hungry City is her
Hungry City. Okay.
Yeah, it's beautiful how food shapes our lives.
Okay.
And it's about cities. She's an urbanist and architect. So, you know, it's just, and it's intuitively obvious.
Mm-hmm.
It started being theorized in the 19th century that cities have to feed themselves. It's cities that have to feed themselves. And rural people now do too, because we've simplified their farms so much. Mm-hmm. They have to go to the grocery store. But cities, mainly, not the Roman Empire, that was a really interesting first example of monoculture and long distance feeding and plantations and so on, what we call plantations, latifundia. So, but mostly the cities have surrounded themselves with ways of producing food for the city. Now, there are a lot of problems. We can talk about classes and, you know, who's literate and who's not, and, you know, how the power field there are a lot of problems with it. But the truth is that cities have mostly fed themselves around themselves. Mm-hmm. When they couldn't anymore, they collapsed.
What government recommendations would you implement?
I would say redesign agricultural policy so it produces healthy food for your population. That doesn't rule out trade, but it says focus there.
FAO, could they make general recommendations that would filter through?
Well, two things is, you know, the FAO is like all international organizations, it's governments that are the formal participants. Mm-hmm. It has proceeded further than most in inviting civil society participation, particularly on the Committee on Food Security. And it has a growing and recently very prominent set of meetings and reports on agroecology. So if we could have that kind of balance between and relationship between farmers who need science and the right kind of science with an agenda to support farmers to diversify the landscape and to grow the kind of food which will produce diverse diets, that would be great. So the Canada Food Guide is a breakthrough in a lot of ways.
One of the particular planks in our platform for survival has to do with developing food guides that have that take account of environmental concerns, of course. Climate being
it's a sustainable development goal too, and that was a huge breakthrough after across these silos to put food security, which used to be only about getting more grains and dairy and meat and so on into people or into the markets. It's moved from, it's a combined food security, which used to be only that, with health, which is about quality diets, which is way more recent. And the third one was environmental sustainability.
That is beautiful, beautiful.
Okay.
I want to. I wish I had 2 more hours at least, but we don't. And
Okay.
you're going to be going to Lund, and good luck there. And let's
Thank you.
stay in touch, because this is beautiful. Thank you. And you
You're welcome.
are saving the world, girl. Don't knock it. Bless your heart, dear. Thank you. See you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.